So I'm glad to finally be getting this video put together and out to you folks. On November 12, 2019, Sheridan County Republican women held a debate on the pro and con positions of Article 5 Amendments Convention of States. 4 of us were invited to a panel. 2 of us were pro Article 5, the other 2 were con. The recording has some audio problems, some road noise, some ambient buzzing, some interference, but I've tried to clean it up as best I could, and hopefully you can hear the conversations from the debate. There are a few points I will clarify during the video, specifically on the ratification process of the Constitution, and of course I want to touch over again the delegates' credentials to that convention. So hopefully with all the adjustments and the improvements, you'll be able to benefit from listening to this video. Thank you very much.
Sorry, okay. All right. I tried to really streamline our meeting today so we could maximize our time with our panel because I'm so excited about these guys being here. Now, as many of you know, I've been talking about this for months, right? I'm like, Convention of States, I don't know what I think. There are people I respect and admire that are for it. There are people that I respect and admire that are against it. Basically, Convention of States, just in a nutshell, is something that is allowed in the Constitution, right? It's built into the Constitution that we can do this if we so choose, but there is a route that it has to take. It has to basically be a movement of the states that say they want to get together and hold it, and there has to be a 2/3 vote to pass, to send on the changes to the Constitution to the federal government in some way. Then they've got to shoot it back to the states, and then so there's a process here, and these guys will talk about it a little more, but it does open up our Constitution to changes. And so this is kind of a big deal. Now, we're going to lay some ground rules because some people have very strong feelings one way or the other about this. And so I started out calling this a debate. We're going to kind of call it a panel, but it is what it is. We have 2 gentlemen that are for it and 2 that are against. We have many in this room with strong opinions as well and who are very educated on the topic. But I don't know what to think about it. And so, again, the impetus for this was me wanting to know more. And so you all get to be, I guess, graced with the presence of these guys that Carla basically pulled together. And again, I'm grateful for what she did and the miles that these guys have driven. So we're going to set a few ground rules. And one is that today we are going to agree to disagree. If somebody sitting next to you doesn't feel the same way you do, that's okay. We need to remember we're all Republicans here. Okay, that's the important thing. And if we can't have civil discourse amongst ourselves, then what good are we when we go out in the world to try and have these discussions with others? And so, keep a cool head. No big deals here. We aren't changing the world today in this room, for certain, right? But appreciate the standpoint of someone else and just show respect for that. So we're going to give each of these gentlemen 6 minutes, roughly. I will set a timer, just so we stay consistent, to give to present their case or what they feel is most relevant. And after we've gone through all of them, I think we'll do maybe another 2 minutes to maybe address things that they've heard from the other panelists. And then we are going to open it up to questions from the floor. Does that sound like a good plan? Okay. All right. So I'm going to introduce them formally, and I will start at the far end with, let me find his bio, Representative Scott Clem. He is serving his 3rd term in the House. He is the House Vice Chair of the Labor, Health, and Social Services Committee. He sits on the Corporations, Elections, and Political Subdivision Committee, the Opioid Addiction Task Force, the Select Committee for Coal, Minerals, Bankruptcy, and the NCSL's Health Committee. In 2016, he went to Williamsburg, Virginia, with 2 other state legislators to participate in a mock convention of states. Doesn't that sound fun? All 50 states were represented at this mock convention. The purpose was to see what a convention of states would look like under Article 5 and how effectively, or not effectively, it would run. He lives in Gillette, where he serves as the pastor of Central Baptist Church. He's married and has 4 children. Please welcome Scott Clem. Next we have Rod Geil, who came from Pine Haven, Wyoming, which is between Gillette and Sundance. He moved to Wyoming for work in the oil and gas industry in 2001. Rod has his bachelor's degree in business from Minot State University in Minot, North Dakota, and a master's degree in administration from Central Michigan University in Mount Pleasant, Michigan. He uses extensive experience in accounting, contract management, budgeting, risk assessment, and cost-benefit analysis, and he believes that the complex can easily be understood by eliminating noise. Please welcome Rod Dial. Next, we have Robert Brown. Robert, give away here so we're on Robert. Robert is a constitutional scholar and a media spokesman for the John Birch Society on Constitutional Issues, with a particular focus on the Article 5 Convention. However, he is best known for his lectures on the Constitution. He has produced 6 of his lectures as a DVD series known as The Constitution is the Solution, which is gaining popularity nationwide. This series includes such titles as The Dangers of Democracy and Enumerated versus Boundless Power. After viewing just 2 of these lectures, a constitutional attorney from New Jersey remarked, "I studied constitutional law under one of the most outstanding constitutional lawyers and law professors in America, and I have learned more from Mr. Brown's 2 DVDs than I did from the professor." Mr. Brown and his family, who is here, his wife Eve, correct, and daughter Christina, 5 months old, precious, are here. A popular constitutional speaker, he's been a guest on dozens of radio shows and lectured for many liberty-minded organizations throughout the country. Please welcome Robert Brown. And on the entry closest to me, we have Eldon Stahl, who was born and raised in Sheridan, Nebraska. He became curious about politics in high school with the help of his parents. Eldon came on staff with the John Birch Society in 2010 as the field coordinator for South Dakota. He is fluent in Spanish, English, and some Russian. Eldon now serves as the field coordinator for the John Birch Society in parts of South Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana. In this role, he trains and recruits volunteers to help carry out the Society's motto of less government, more responsibility, and with God's help, a better world. Eldon, his wife Julia, and their 3 children reside near Billings. Please welcome Eldon Stahl. Well, thank you so much, guys. I think, just since we started on that end with Scott, we'll continue in that manner. We will let the panelists that are for the the Convention of States speak first. And we only have 3 total microphones. So these 2 are going to share one, but do pull it off the stand and talk into it. Let's make sure they're on. All right. And then when we have questions, they just get to fight over the mic. So, all right. So I'm going to take, set a timer for 6 minutes, Scott, and you don't have to fill overtime if you don't. So, go ahead.
Again, my name is Scott Flynn. Thank you for the invitation of being here. It really is an honor. By the way, if you see Senator Bill Biden, you let him know that he owes me gas for coming over. Rod in here, the whole panel. We might as well. He's a nice guy, so really enjoy that. It's funny, this wild rhino thing came out and it's on your tables and all that. You'll notice I am, according to them, one of the more conservative members of the House. I think it's pretty accurate in that way. I like that it says I'm more conservative than Mark Jennings over there. I point that out to say this. I have good friends who are very, very conservative like me, and we think a whole lot differently on this issue. When I first came into politics, I did not really have a position on the Article 5 Convention. Really didn't. I was honored to participate in this mock convention in Williamsburg, Virginia. Got to know more about the process and actually see kind of firsthand the practicality of it if it would actually work. Is this on? Does this work? Okay. Everybody hear me okay? All right, good. There's a few things that I learned throughout all this, and hopefully I'll get to speak on some of this a little bit later on, particularly maybe about the nuts and bolts of how that convention went. But there's a couple questions that come into mind as far as when it comes to Article 5. Number one, what is it? And if you look in your Constitution, it talks about the U.S. Constitution. There's 2 ways in order for amendments to the Constitution to come into being and to be ratified. And it talks about the ratification process as well. And we've seen throughout the history of the United States that only one method has been used, and that has been the method of Congress. Upon a 2/3 vote of each chamber, they agree on an amendment, and then there's a ratification process, and there's a method of ratification as well that can be chosen by the states, 2 different methods. But essentially what happens is it's given to the states, a certain majority has to ratify that, and then it becomes part of the Constitution. the other way to propose amendments, and it goes through the same ratification process and all of that, but instead of Congress proposing the amendments, what the Constitution allows is for states to propose amendments as well. So why is that important? Well, if you looked at our Congress lately, I mean, they're a joke. They're a joke. I'm going to be a Debbie Downer. Hopefully, I don't appear too crazy this morning. I really do think our republic is on its last days. I really do. I'm not going to get into that. Otherwise, you're not going to like me. And you're going to think I'm a fool. But that's okay. I'll say this: our Congress is broken. We have given more and more power to centralized government. And the Constitution allows for this framework for states to step in and say, you're not going to do that. And that's the power. It's about the state. It comes down to this question, who decides? Is it Congress, given unlimited power in our centralized government? Or is it the states? Is it the actual republic? You know, when we've seen throughout history that there has been an erosion of power from the states to a centralized government. I mean, you think about that even with your senators, your U.S. senators. It used to be that states chose those. I particularly wish we'd go back to that way, but of course that was a constitutional amendment that was passed. And so now we all vote on our U.S. senators. But I want you to consider this. I think about Obamacare and that whole fight and everything like that. Originally in Obamacare, what would happen is Medicaid expansion was mandatory. It went to court and it was deemed unconstitutional. But our Senate, our U.S. Senate, could have killed that if they were beholden to the states. In other words, if they had to go back to their state legislatures and say, hey, yeah, we voted to make you spend more money. That would have never happened. And so that's just one example. And so we really have, and you'll hear this probably, the runaway term, a runaway convention and all that. I want to tell you, we have a runaway government right now. And so the question is do we continue the status quo? I appreciate the fellows from the other side who will probably say, follow the Constitution and elect the right people. Boy, I wish we'd have thought of that 100 years ago. Electing the right people. Who'd have thunk it? Let me ask you this. How many election cycles is it going to take for us to elect the right people? That's a serious question. I agree 100% in the idealistic part of that. Let's elect the right people who will follow the Constitution the way that we see fit. For right now, we elect a bunch of people who follow the Constitution according to how the courts have interpreted it. And if you look at that book, it's huge. So we have a problem. And for me, the question becomes, do we continue the status quo, and where does that take us? I'm sorry, the status quo leads to our ruin, folks. I got 4 reasons to support this. It's my children, Faith, Justice, Zane, and Miles. Because without any kind of intervention, and I hope you see the seriousness and hear the seriousness in my voice, without any kind of intervention, the status quo will lead to our ruin, and we will not have a republic. We won't. It is not practical to say that we are going to... I'm sorry, I get fired up. It is not practical to say that we need to follow the Constitution and elect the right people who will do that. And again, I come back with how many election cycles is that going to take? The solution is in the Constitution. The solution is the states taking back their rightful power. We are a sovereign state among many sovereign states. We are a union of states, and sometimes states need to act like it, like we're sovereign. Well, this is one of those moments where we can. Now, it gets into, well, what if we call it a convention and it goes runaway and all this kind of stuff? We can get into the brass tacks of all of that. I can share with you my own personal perspective on how the convention went. How much time do I have, by the way? I'm done. I'm done. Whoops. Maybe I'll get to talk on that a little bit later on. But it's a marvelous thing. Anyway, thank you.
It just reminded me in the style.
Talking to.
We did an interview in Gillette, and it just reminded me when you talked with such passion. Am I done?
No.
Anyway, we were discussing how a convention would go, and if somebody brought what I deal with is convention states project. 3 subject areas: fiscal restraint, term limits, and narrowing the scope of federal regulation, federal jurisdiction. Anyway, we were talking on the radio, and the question came up was, what if somebody brings up Second Amendment? And Scott had the perfect answer because it's just a simple
Point of word.
he was not quick. But he did. He got it straight to the point. 34 states have to set an agenda. If they don't set the agenda, it doesn't count as 34 states aggregating to the call. It's pretty simple. You can conflate, you can confuse into a lot of noise, as I said in the bio. You can throw a lot of noise in there, but it just comes down to simple facts. There has been a book gathered up all of the conventions that our country has seen. It's been about 37, somewhere in there, conventions in our district. They've been regional. They've been discussing, okay, let's, somebody wants to have a call for a convention for Indian work. They wanted to have, they brought the Indian nations in to talk about this stuff. It had an agenda. It had a subject. They never, not one of them strayed from the agenda. We did this for 150 years before the Declaration of Independence. It's an institution. We've lost institutions. But institutions are there nonetheless. We don't have in the Constitution due process. And yet everybody knows we due process it, don't we? It's an institution. Exactly. Anyway, and marriage is an institution. In the Constitution, conventions for 5 generations brought cohesiveness to the colonies and then to the states. It's an amazing thing how you can just get together in a convention and it's just a meeting. You have an objective to talk about, to discuss it. You figure out ways you might solve it, and you pass a suggestion that goes to the state and colony governments, and then they build it. It's an amazing thing. It's nothing complicated about it. But we've lost that institution. People make money off fighting against what our Constitution gives us. Alexander Hamilton in Final Federalist Paper 85, his closing argument that no doubt saved the Constitution from not being ratified. He went in it and talked about, okay, for all of the things that might be wrong, defects in the Constitution, there is a way to fix it. The opponents, the anti-federalists, wanted a perfect document to start with. Why should we put up with all these defects? Imperfect men do not make perfect documents. And to save the day, when he laid down the final 4 paragraphs of his Federalist 85, I've got a copy of it here, and I put a stack of them out there. You can read his words. It closed the deal. They had a long, 2 years, trying to get it ratified. And he gave that to New York, who was probably the most anti-federal of all of them. And it closed the deal. This is something that our founders wanted us to do, to rein in the federal government. They were all scared of it. They weren't going to sign on. Look, I don't even come to the convention because they were scared of it. They didn't show up. It's just an amazing thing how our Constitution is written for the common man. You don't need a lot of legal interpretation. You don't need a lot of opinion. You read it, you observe it, and it all makes sense. Conventions are no different. It's something, it's a way that we can work through our legislators, state legislators, to fix this country. They say that why does the Constitution need fixing? The biggest reason is because our Constitution is no longer a little pocket-sized, which I have on this table out there too. It is now almost 3,000 pages at the Supreme Court, as in if you would excuse my language, it is bastardized. That's wonderful document. They say, and I'll give you just one example, Obamacare is Constitution. So it wasn't ratified, but it's not, in our understanding, it's not part of the Constitution. But it is there. It is declared constitutional by the experts that Congress follows.
They say Congress doesn't follow the Constitution anymore, but they do. If they didn't, they'd be thrown out of office because they have to go by what the Supreme Court tells them to do. If they bring up another piece of legislation that is outside the CONAN, as we call it, the Constitutional Annotated, they bring up legislation outside that big book. It's about this law. I meant to bring it. It was on a video or something we showed today, but it's fine. It's about that big, about 8 pounds. And if Congress doesn't go by that, they can't bring up legislation because everybody knows it's not constitutional in Congress. You can take all the good people you want in the world. You vote them into office. 2010, Mark Meckler, our president, was part of the Tea Party. And he brought a major sweep along with other people. It was just him, he was the first to get it. But he was part of that movement. Brought in a sweeping change in 2010. Remember that. It was huge. It was great. What changed? What, of all things, changed with that sweeping and sweeping? You put good guys into a swamp, and if you don't go along to get along, you change it. You've got to change the system.
Thank you, Rod. Thank you, man.
Sounds like it's working. Okay. First of all, I really appreciate the passion the two gentlemen to my right exhibit for our nation. Great patriots. I really respect that even though they're on the, in my view, the wrong side of this issue, they're there for the right reasons. And as a researcher, I'm all about facts and evidence. And when we all understand the same history, the same facts, the same evidence, we tend to come to the same conclusions. For that reason, one of the things I've done today, I've brought a stack of papers here that includes citations, references, and things that I'll be using here over the next few minutes, because I want everyone here to be able to look up for yourself the things that I'm sharing with you. Because I don't want you to just trust me, oh, there's this guy that claims to be a constitutional scholar or whatever. I want you to look up the references yourself. Because the greatest power we have as a people is that we can read, we can understand for ourselves, and then we can exert that pressure. Scott earlier was talking about electing the right people. That is not what I recommend. It's a good thing, definitely. A few years ago, my congressman was the wrong person. He was following the Constitution about half the time. In about 4 months of me working with about 200 people across our state, we got him following the Constitution quite strictly because of what we were talking about before this forum, the effort you're doing here to hold your elected officials accountable. That's the crucial part. Not getting the right person elected. Because as George Washington said, few men can withstand the highest bidder. And so we, the people, need to be the highest bidder by holding their position in office over their heads. And it took 4 months, my congressman suddenly totally changed his entire voting from what he'd always done previously. I want to share just a little bit of evidence with you. The book that Rod shared, Conventions That Made America, is missing a few conventions in our history. About 16 in particular. Because those 16 were runaway conventions. They're not included in that book. The most notable of which is the 1787 convention, where our Constitution was written. That's probably the everlasting debate between our two sides here, is what really happened in 1787. On their side, they'll always defend that 1787 convention, those delegates were fully authorized to make whatever changes they felt necessary, including replacing the entire existing Constitution. If that were true, do you think the delegates would have known it? Stands to reason, doesn't it? If the delegates in the 1787 convention were truly authorized by their states to make any changes to the Constitution that they needed to do, they probably would have known that. So when that question came up in 1787, do we really have the authority to scrap the Articles of Confederation and replace it with a completely new form of government and a new constitution? That was a great debate that they held in 1787. I'm going to share with you just a few of the citations from that. For example, Charles Pinckney, Elbridge Gerry both raised concerns, one from South Carolina and another from Massachusetts. He doubted whether the commissions, that being their state commissions of the deputies, would authorize a discussion of a new form of government. We have John Lansing from New York, who also said the same type of thing. In his case, he probably had the most limited of all the convention delegates' commissions, and he went home. I don't have the authority to be talking about this. I'm going home. But South Carolina and Massachusetts also felt that way. They stayed and continued the debate. William Patterson from New Jersey, this one's interesting. We have to keep within the limits we were given, or we should be charged by our constituents with usurpation. Let's return to our states and obtain larger powers, not assume them of ourselves. What's he saying? We clearly don't have the authority to be doing what we're proposing to do. Let's go ask for permission before we proceed. Now, that was one side of the argument. The founders didn't always agree with each other 100%. What did the other side of the argument say? Did they step up and say, look at our commissions, we have full authority? No, they didn't. Here's the response they received. I'll give just a few. Alexander Hamilton says, to rely on and propose a plan that's not adequate to these exigencies, urgent needs of our nation, merely because it's not clearly within our powers would be to sacrifice the means to the end. What's he saying? Okay, maybe it's not clearly within our powers, but we need to do it anyway. You see the same thing from James Madison. It's essential such changes be instituted by some informal and unauthorized propositions. Okay, you're right. We probably don't have the authority to do this, but we need to. Edmund Randolph. There are great seasons when persons with limited powers are justified in exceeding them. Do you see where the idea that the 1787 convention was a runaway convention comes from? Then in the ratifying conventions, the states then have their own conventions to decide whether or not to adopt the new Constitution. The same issue came up again. The anti-federalists, those against the Constitution, brought up this charge, the convention exceeded their authority. Here's a few quotes on that one as well. Patrick Henry, that they exceeded their power is perfectly clear. And these are all in the handout I'll pass around. Robert Whitehill, during the Pennsylvania ratification, they assumed powers that they had no legal title to. They've overthrown that government which they were called upon to amend. So they're making these charges against those who created the Constitution. What was the response? Again, was it, well, here are the commissions. Look, we had full authorization. If that were true, that's what it would have been. Nobody said that. For example, we have James Wilson in the Pennsylvania Ratification Convention. In his defense of the validity of what the convention did, he says the federal convention did not act at all upon the powers given to them by the states. Is that a runaway convention? Well, it is. The urgent question at this point is, though, what authority did they use? Did they just go rogue and make things up and do whatever they felt like? No. They felt like we still have to follow some authority. And what is the highest authority in our land? We, the people, are a higher power than the states. And so Madison, in the 1787 convention, brought these two sides together with this statement. The people were, in fact, the fountain of all power. By resorting to them, all difficulties were got over. They could alter constitutions as they pleased. This is the precedent from 1787, was we can ignore state delegate commissions, and by saying we're just going to appeal to the people, we can do whatever we want. That's the precedent we're looking at from 1787. That is why I say conventions today cannot be limited. On the handout as well, you'll see legal precedent says the same thing. Thank you.
I'd like to restate what Robert said here. I hope you look up these quotes yourself, and I can't say that more than enough. These quotes are often taken out of context, and you need that context to see where they're arguing and making their quotes from, and to show the discussion that's going on at the time. Hamilton, of course, did have much more restrictions on his authority from New York, as that came out after the Congress came out with their statement about the first time that it was mentioned about revising the Articles, and so New York picked up on that next. And so Hamilton did have limited authority, which is why, and I need to stress this, it's why he never did vote on anything. at that convention. He did participate in discussion, but he didn't vote or do anything official. He did at the very end sign this document because I'm sure he knew it was quite an important, significant step in our country. The Madison quote came in a discussion talking about such things as going beyond their authority, which he to this day, or to his dying days, admitted nothing going beyond their authority. He never did admit anything to that like. He did argue that in case people thought that they acted beyond their authority, he would take their position and turn it on them. He would begin, if you consider the argument of the unauthorized action, it is still justified, even if you consider that. Everything they did was normal, everything they did was proper, and with high regard for making the government of this country better. Edmund Randolph's quote was much the same as Madison's. It wasn't an admission of that they did anything unauthorized. It was taking the stance that if you think that they did, if that's your argument that they did go beyond, especially after the Annapolis Convention, where they went home specifically to get full authority, that if they did not do what they actually did to go beyond whatever it took to make the government stronger, that was the position. It was not an admission that they did anything unauthorized. It was just that they had full authority to do what needed to be done to render the government, the country, adequate to the exigencies of the Union. I won't mention too long on Patrick Henry's quote. He was a man of theater. He was not a man of actual factual arguments. In fact, Thomas Jefferson was on the legal board that he denied. He voted to deny Patrick Henry his law license. Patrick Henry was so persuasive that he did get his law license to practice, but Thomas Jefferson was never impressed with his legal credentials. One other point is Patrick Henry was positioning Virginia to be the head and the reign supreme of the southern states when and if the country did not form. He wanted to form his own southern states country, and of course Virginia would be the supreme of the states. D. James Wilson's quote is interesting. He talks about the powers given to them by the states. The convention had no powers. They had authority to discuss whatever it took to get to render the country safe and strong, but they had no power to do anything. It was just there to debate and talk about what needed to be done and what changes needed to be made in the full extent. So there was no powers granted by the states.
Takes a
Okay,
minute.
if I stand, or
Absolutely.
I'm just more comfortable standing. Well, before we start talking actually about should we amend the Constitution, we need to actually answer one basic question. Why was Article 5, the amendment procedures, why were they put in the Constitution in the first place? Now you can imagine a wonderful slide up here. There it is. Well, several of our founders commented on this. Hamilton said a mode should be established for supplying defects in the Constitution. Madison even wrote in Federalist 43 that it was for the amendment of errors. George Washington gave his farewell address in 1796. He said, if the distribution or modification of the constitutional ballot powers be in any particular wrong, let it be corrected by an amendment in the way in which the Constitution designates. Then, this is something that's often quoted, but George Mason said the plan now to be formed was during the 1787 Convention. The plan now before will certainly become effective. Amendments, therefore, will be necessary. So you see a pattern here. If there's something wrong, fix the Constitution. But what if it's not something wrong with the Constitution? We often speak of the term reigning in the federal government. But here's an interesting quote that I like to point out, all right, by Patrick Henry. When the Constitution was sent to the states, went to ratification in each state, in Virginia, Patrick Henry spoke. And he talked about the idea of, well, what about this idea of amending the Constitution to rein in a rogue federal government and using its powers? Well, I was kind of laughed at, actually, by him. He said, we were told that, you remember this guy, he's the give me liberty or give me death. Imagine the fiery speech in Virginia. We were told that to prevent abuses in our government, we will assemble in convention, recall our delegated powers, and punish our servants for abusing the trust we reposed in them. That's what they were told. What does he think about that? He says, oh, sir, we should have fine times indeed, if to punish tyrants it were only sufficient to assemble the people. Wouldn't that be nice? Imagine what he'd say about, say, these gun-free zones and the signs that they put up. That's not enough, is it? No. You can't just write words on paper and expect tyrants to obey that. Well, we talk about reigning in the federal government. Reigning in is a metaphorical term referring to a horse that's gotten out of control. And what do you use to control the horse? Well, the reins. Now, there's two possible reasons for the horse getting out of control, I suppose. It could be the reins, there's something wrong with them. Or it could be the rider simply let go of the reins. So whose fault is that? Is that the reins or the rider? If there's something wrong with the reins, what do? You fix the reins. But if the rider let go, you can't blame the horse or the reins. Well, here's another thing that Patrick Henry said about this. We've heard a couple of times, I think, already about, well, don't worry, nothing bad will come out of this convention. Because you need 3/4 of the states to ratify it. Of course, nothing would happen that's bad from that. Well, we've already heard about the 17th Amendment. And I did a little investigation in South Dakota, just next door to here. When it came up for ratification, all legislators present voted for the 17th Amendment. It was 80-some% Republican in each chamber. Okay. Well, here's what Patrick Henry said. Now, you might think, well, we can stop bad amendments. But what does it take to stop good amendments? 13 states can stop a bad one. How does it take to stop a good one? So Patrick Henry said, a trifling minority may reject the most salutary amendments. If this is an easy mode of securing, is this an easy mode of securing the public liberty? It is, sir, a most fearful situation when the most contemptible minority can prevent the alteration of the most oppressive government. Now let's take, for example, a popular proposal for amendment among conservatives. Balanced budget amendment. Is it wise to place in the hands of the most fiscally irresponsible states, the 13 most fiscally irresponsible states, California, New York, Illinois comes to mind, the fiscal sanity of the federal government? Interesting question. Kind of other side of that coin, isn't it? Well, something that I would encourage folks to look more into, like Robert said, and I would certainly urge you to contact your state legislators, urge them to oppose an Article 5 convention, which sometimes is called various things. But in my opinion, it's not something that we want to get into. There's very many unanswered questions, but we'll go into that later. So, thank you very much.
I'm enlightened already. So, since we've all gotten to hear kind of a baseline from each of these fellows, then let's go back to Scott. And if you guys have anything you want to address in addition to what you said, or rebut anything that someone on the opposite side of the opinion said. So 2 minutes for each.
What kind of solutions did you hear? This is where I get real pessimistic. Because the status quo is broken. And on one hand, we're saying, all right, it's either the rain's fault or the people who are holding the reins. Who are the people? The people are us. And if the people aren't holding the reins, it's the people's fault. What does that say about our country and the status that we're in? The status quo is broken. And that's where it really becomes a difficult thing for me. Do I wish we would have to use the Article 5 Convention? No. But and I say this with all seriousness, I'm not trying to be a fearmonger, but I look at $23 trillion in debt. I look at what our country is doing as far as not following the Constitution already. I don't think there's enough. You have that sheet right there in front of you. Okay? You can see all those who, at least this group says, are not conservative. They're not following the mandates of the Republican Party. How effective has the people of Wyoming been in holding their feet to the fire? You tell me that. And we're going to do that for Congress? Sorry, the system's broken. It's not going to happen. So it's one of those radical things of the status quo is our country is doomed. We are heading towards a fiscal cliff. We are on the verge of a new monetary paradigm. Make no mistake about it. It changes every 50 to 60 years. And we're on that verge. We're on the cusp of that. We're on the cusp of, I believe, World War III. We're on the cusp of the greatest depression that has ever been. And I'm not exaggerating. We're in the longest running... I got to digress a little bit. The point is this. You either continue the status quo and you're doomed, or you do something radical that's never been done before as far as the states getting together and proposing amendments to the Constitution under this constitutional framework. It's never been done before in that way. You either go that route and you try something radical, or you continue the status quo and you're doomed. And I guess the fear-mongering part of it is as well, it's going to be a runaway convention. I can go into the roadblocks that the Constitution gives, and as we mentioned just a moment ago when we had the mock convention. If someone would have said, hey, we're going to do something outside of the mandates, any one of the states could rise up and say, point of order. And even if it goes through after that, there's other roadblocks that we can talk about. The practicality of this is what's missing. And you don't hear about the practical aspects of this. And hopefully I can get into more of that a little bit
Sorry for walking away there. I wanted to hand out this whole discussion surrounds and started with the runaway. I just handed out the actual credentials the states gave their delegates. 2 states, Massachusetts and New York, reference article. No other state did. So there was a discussion. New York came, Alexander Hamilton included, came to Philadelphia. They left because they didn't have authority. You see it on the paper. Alexander Hamilton said this is still a good idea, came back. He never voted, he did sign. Massachusetts had a little huddle and said, we still think this is part of what we're supposed to be doing. And they stayed, and they voted. After the convention was over, the state legislature of Massachusetts, who gave them the credentials, voted to say that those delegates from Massachusetts did exactly the right thing. That you had their credentials. If these guys didn't know what their credentials were, I think we do. This comes from the archives. 12 states were showed at the convention. 10 states had full authority to not only do what they thought they should do, but get with the other state representatives to come up with other provisions for the exigencies save the Union. These states were at war. New Jersey and New York were at war, almost to the point of battle, over trade. And nothing was getting done because the Articles of Confederation did not address it. The Articles of Confederation had no purview to call a convention. The states that were doing so.
So the document that I just passed out in the video to the listeners, it was the actual credentials passed by the states in their resolutions to attend the Convention of 1787. As we all know, even though we don't see it in D.C. right now with the impeachment hearings, actual legislative resolutions and documentation in print supersedes the hearsay, poll quotes, what people think they thought they heard. The actual documentation supersedes as evidence for what was going on. So, to start with Virginia, going to the text, authorized as deputies from this Commonwealth to meet, authorized by other state, to join with them, devising and discussing all alterations and further provisions as may be necessary to render the federal Constitution adequate to the exigencies of the Union. One thing to remember, Constitution back then did not mean a written document. It meant the organization of government. The Articles of Confederation was not a constitution. It were the rules that were provided for the basis of the Continental Congress. It was not, the Constitution does not refer to the Articles. Constitution, as I said, refers to the organization of the government. So when they're talking about to render the federal Constitution adequate, they're talking about a government that's adequate for the exigencies of the Union. The Articles of Confederation basically left that Congress powerless to do hardly almost anything, as the states were still in control, and 13 states had to agree with everything that they were going to do. So it just shows right here, Virginia, which I don't know why Patrick Henry said what he did say about superseding their authorization. It says very plainly, authorized, discussing all such alterations and further provisions, meaning not just to tweak whatever needs to happen in the government, but to do whatever and further provisions that may be necessary. Pretty plain words. New Jersey, devising such other provisions as shall appear to be necessary to render the Constitution of the federal government adequate. Pennsylvania, who the people say there was a lot of discussion about whether they were authorized or not, to join, of necessity of revising the federal Constitution for purposes of making alterations and amendments as the exigencies of our public affairs require, to join with them in devising, deliberating on, and discussing all such alterations and further provisions may be necessary to render the federal Constitution fully adequate to the exigencies of the Union. Very, very plain, very explicit. Powers, unlimited, do what you need to do. North Carolina, to meet and confer with such deputies as may be appointed with them to discuss and decide upon the most effectual means to remove the defects of the federal union. New Hampshire, deputies to join with them in devising and discussing all such alterations and further provisions as to render the federal Constitution adequate to the exigencies of the Union. Delaware, to join with them, devising, deliberating, discussing such alternatives and farther provisions as may be necessary to render the federal Constitution adequate to the exigencies of the Union. Georgia, to join with them in devising and discussing all such alterations and farther provisions as may be necessary to render the federal Constitution to the exigencies of the Union. Those states, those 7 states, passed identical full authority to their commissioners going to the convention. At that time, after those 7 states called for that convention, then the Congress stepped in. Even though they did not have any authority in the Articles of Confederation to step in or call a convention or do anything of the sort, they stepped in. As you can see at the very bottom, in the red and just above where the red paragraph is, on February 21st, 1787, for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation and such alterations and provisions therein as shall, when agreed to in Congress and confirmed by the states, render the federal Constitution adequate to the exigencies of the government and the preservation of the Union. So they wanted to get in the game too, even though they had no authority. Nothing in the articles that said they can do this. So it's kind of strange that they bring this about. And they go on a little bit. They did use the word Constitution, but that means the organized government. Very plain language. After Congress made their statement, and it was just a statement, it wasn't an order, it wasn't a resolution, it was nothing official, it was nothing stamped, nothing sent to the administration of the several states. It was just a pronouncement saying, yeah, we think this convention should happen too. That's all it was. It had no force of law, it had no restrictions, it had no effect to the states at all. New York was next, for the sole purpose, for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation are the key words there. One of the definitions in that day and age, revising meant a rewrite. You're going to update it. You're not just going to tweak, you're not going to just fashion a few words. You're going to rewrite whatever you're dealing with. South Carolina, in devising and discussing all such alterations, clauses, articles, and provisions as may be thought necessary to render the federal Constitution entirely adequate to the actual situation and future of good government of Confederated States. Approved and agreed by them, duly ratified, confirmed by the several states, will effectually provide for the exigencies of the Union. Massachusetts, which they say was more limiting than the others, I'll leave that to your discretion, for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. Not to forget that revising at that point in time meant rewrite, and also after the delegates stayed, voted, participated in the convention, even though Elbridge Gerry talked about maybe exceeding their authorization, when they went back to Massachusetts, the same body that gave them the right and the commission to go to the convention, they reviewed all the happenings that went on at the convention. They made the proclamation saying, it took a vote, and said that their delegates did exactly what they were told. That is also a written legislative resolution, not just hearsay, not a poll quote, not something that might have happened 200 years ago and people said, oh yeah, this guy said this. This is actual resolution. Connecticut. To confer with such delegates appointed by the several states for the purposes mentioned in the said Act of Congress, and to discuss such alterations and provisions agreeable to the general principles of the Republican government, as they shall think proper, to render the federal Constitution adequate to the exigencies of the government and the preservation of the Union. Do whatever it takes. That's what they were saying. Do whatever it takes. Maryland, who actually commissioned their delegates to go, the commission had already started, so they were in kind of a hurry to get there. Maryland, May 26, 1787, to join with them in consideration such alterations and further provisions as may be necessary to render the federal Constitution adequate to the exigencies of the Union. All of the states addressed it, pretty much fashioned. You can argue that 2 of the states maybe didn't have full authorization. Massachusetts obviously did, but that seems to be the consensus that they went above their authority. I think that's arguable. Regardless, 10 of the states had full authority. It as proven written documentation. I hope you'll have a chance to read the handout I gave you, or here online. I will also leave some of this material in the details below the video. I guess the question I have here is, why do the opponents of the Article 5 Amendments Convention still say that the delegates went beyond their authority? The documentation is here. It's in the archives. You can look it up. You can see it. It is not true. So in the next video, you will see and you will hear the dismissing of this evidence, of this factual documentation, by saying, well, why didn't they know it? Why did they say that they didn't know it? I think a poll quote from 200 and some years ago that were oftentimes written down after the event and not even during a session of legislation. The poll quote out of context should never supersede the written resolutions of a legislative body. It is very much alike what we are seeing in Washington right now in the impeachment hearings. Hearsay statements that they thought that somebody had told them that might have happened never should supersede a written documentation.
I appreciate Rod covering that. As you look through the delegate commissions, like I said before, what did they understand their delegate commissions to mean? He says 10 states had full authority. So why didn't they say so? One thing that wasn't mentioned was 9 of those delegate commissions, and I don't have them memorized off the top of my head which ones were which. 9 of them, at the conclusion, referenced how the ratification process should proceed. Remember, when they called the convention, they were under the Articles of Confederation. Article 13 of the Articles of Confederation says any changes to our Constitution have to be approved by Congress and thereafter ratified by all 13 state legislatures. You look at the delegate commissions, 9 of the states reference that concept, referring to the need for ratification going through Congress and state legislatures. And yet that's not what happened. As a matter of fact, no state legislature ever voted whether or not to ratify the new Constitution, because in Article 7 of the new Constitution it says we're going to create a new constitutional ratification procedure and make it retroactively effective for this new proposal. They changed the ratification rules right there underneath the convention itself. And 9 states was all it required. And it wasn't state legislatures either. 9 states, conventions. So again, 9 states told their delegates you're going to have to follow the Article 13 ratification procedure. They didn't. They threw it out. That caused Madison to declare, or actually to admit, he says, it is admitted the convention has departed from their commissions. Instead of reporting a plan to be ratified by all 13 state legislatures, they put forward a plan to be ratified by only 9 states. It was the legislature, not the legislatures. He admitted clearly the convention, in his words, departed from the tenor of their commissions. So anyone who says otherwise isn't telling you the true history. Perhaps they don't know the true history. But I think Madison did know the true history, don't you?
You know, I really enjoy talking about the ratification, which needs to be clarified here, and I will avoid his dismissive remark about how we don't know our history. A scholar should know that there were 3 documents sent from the convention in 1787 to the Congress: the Constitution itself, a letter from George Washington talking about the convention and that process and what we've come up with, and also there was a resolution drafted by Alexander Hamilton that talked about the proposal of a change in ratification, and if it were to be approved by the legislatures, they should send it on to the convention. All 13 states had done just that. They had approved the proposal to change the ratification to 9 states before it was actually ratified by 9 states. So it seems kind of disingenuous to say that the convention changed the ratification and went all crazy. It didn't. All states, including Rhode Island, decided that they'll send this changed ratification along with the Constitution therein, that they would go by this change and see where it fell. It was an all or nothing kind of proposal, granted, but I think it bears out that everybody agreed to the ratification. They may not, in their convention speeches, talked with such, I'll use his word, tenor. So the thing of it is the ratification was very obvious, going to be 9 states if they went down this road. They didn't have to go down this road. They could have rejected the whole thing, said do it again. So let me read parts of this resolution on the ratification change. The preceding Constitution laid before Congress. I'll just read the yellow highlighted parts here to save some time. It is the opinion of this convention be submitted to a convention of delegates chosen by each state under the recommendation of its legislature for the assent and ratification. Each convention assenting to and ratifying the same should give notice thereof to the United States in Congress assembled. It is the opinion of this convention 9 states shall have ratified this Constitution. Congress assembled should fix a day on which electors should be appointed by the states which shall have ratified the same. Proceed, at the end there, proceed to execute this Constitution by unanimous order of the convention, George Washington, President. It should be mentioned here that Washington his position on the convention from the very beginning, he would not accept any role with the convention if it was just going to amend and try and fix the Articles of Confederation. In a letter to James Knox, Washington said that he was not interested in attending or representing Virginia if it were just to amend the Articles. Washington wanted a whole new effective national government to be better involved with international affairs. His position was very public and widely known. And I enjoy talking about this, I guess you call it almost fake history, that people went beyond their authority, especially on the ratification, that the convention changed the ratification and that's how it got ratified. It's not even true. It was projected to all 13 states and they all said, yes, we will take this up in convention, tacitly accepting the fact that 9 states would be okay. 13 states is ridiculous. So I'd love to address this quote. We'll put that in quotes itself. Just as was said here, that Madison acknowledged this deception of ratification, and the quote being used, the pull quote, I'll call it, that the convention, in quotes, departed from the tenor of their commission, unquote. Again, out of context. You got to read the whole phrase to see where he's coming from, the conversation going on. There was a discussion about the ratification in Federalist 40, and the full quote of that paragraph, in one particular, it is admitted that the convention, having departed from the tenor of their commission, instead of reporting a plan requiring a confirmation of all the states, they have reported a plan which is to be confirmed and may be carried into effect by 9 states only. He's not admitting that they departed from the tenor. What he's talking about is they're changing a proposed plan to ratify with 3/4 of the states. That's Article 5. His very last sentence in this paragraph. At this objection, therefore, has been in a manner waived by those who have criticized the powers of the convention, I dismiss it without further observation. He did not say they went past the tenor of their commission.
Okay.
I didn't get to my slide.
Yeah. Well, I suppose I could talk a little bit about that if we have the slides there. But a lot of people want to know, well, what do we do instead of an Article 5 convention? This is a common argument. We start the discussion and then they say, well, they didn't propose any solutions. Well, that's really not the topic at hand, but it kind of not naturally follows that, okay, if not this, then what, right? It's kind of like the argument they say, well, we have to do something. I'd like to amend that. We have to do something wise. We have to do something prudent. We have to do something appropriate. And what was it that the founders recommended? Well, one of the things that Madison touched on in the Federal Papers was the disquietude of the people, which can be something very strong. And I'm sure you've used that term many times, disquietude. Back then and still today, it means that people are getting a little bit upset about what their representatives are doing. And if you're elected to office, you know that if enough of them get enough disquietude, you won't be seeing the halls of the state capitol or wherever it might be. So it's a very powerful thing. But it also, Hamilton, he said that the people are the natural guardians of the Constitution. Well, we need educated people to enforce the Constitution. That doesn't happen by chance. We have to actively do that. The question was raised, or pointed out, and said, well, it's not practical to follow the Constitution. Okay, well, if it's not practical to say we should follow the Constitution, then why are we amending the Constitution in the first place? Wouldn't they ignore that too, a new amendment? It doesn't make any sense. Another distraction we heard. Well, we're just following a 3,000-page Constitution today, and therefore, well, I would just say Article 5 amends the pocket Constitution, not the 3,000-page Constitution. So that's really a distraction. We'll get into it.
All right, let's give these guys a quick hand. This is so I guess my question for the group, we've got about 20 minutes. Do we want to have them go through again and enlighten us with some more, or would we like to start with questions?
Like that.
You want to go with questions? Okay, I know there's going to be many. So, let's see. What's a fair way to do this? Okay, first of all, ground rules for some questions. Don't tell a story in your question. Keep it very brief and concise, and only ask one at a time if you can. So try and limit it. And if you could address the gentleman that you would like to answer it, or just if you say you would like someone for this to answer or against, or we'll let him arm wrestle. Or yes, there we go. Both sides will get an option or have the ability to answer questions. Thank you very much. Charles.
Very good presentation by both sides. I think I have a question for all four of you. As I understand the rules of the COS, it takes 34 states to call it and 38 to adopt anything that's proposed by it. It leaves us a wiggle room of 12 states. I'd like for you to answer for me, honestly, do any of you believe in your heart that you will get a ratification vote from Hawaii, California, Washington, Oregon, New Mexico, Minnesota, Illinois, Maryland, Delaware, Rhode Island, New York, Connecticut, Vermont, or Maine? Do you believe that, or because if you don't, then we're whistling Dixie. We're trying to cure metastasized cancer with an aspirin.
Good question. Yeah, that was one of the challenges when we went through this. Is this on? No. When I went through the convention of states, I mean, it was an invitation to everybody, those who support, those who were naysayers. And one of the comments that the gentleman had made is he came away with from the convention of states saying that first of all, I thought it was going to be a runaway thing, and it turned out it wasn't. But then his comment was, well, you're never going to get anything passed anyway. Because it's just a very difficult process, and it rightly should be. Because you have to stay on task. At any point in there where it becomes a runaway, you can call point of order. Even then, there's these things where they say, well, Congress is going to get involved, they ignore the law anyway. Well, according to the Constitution, the only thing that Congress gets to do is call the time and place. What if they decided they want to set the rules? You know what happens if the governor of Wyoming wants to set the rules for the legislature? We tell them to go pound sand. We're running things by our own rules. So they run things by their own rules. What if they do something constitutional and they go outside of the purview of the application that's called? Well, Congress doesn't have to put it out for ratification by the states. What happens if Congress drops the ball and it does that anyway? Well, then it goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is going to rule on it. What happens if the Supreme Court drops the ball then? Well, then it has to go to the states, and the states have to do that. So, yeah, if we're talking about something outside of the purview, like the Second Amendment being abolished or something like that, do you think that's actually going to happen? No, and it's going to be a conglomerated mess for the next 10 years in court battles and Congress and all of that kind of stuff being played out in the media every single day. It's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. And if you have good ideas, that's going back to the question here, that's a real difficulty. Are you actually going to be able to pass something given some of these other states? Well, yeah, that's a hard thing. So I guess we're left with what? Enforcing the Constitution? Go people. Go get them. Let's do that in Wyoming. We haven't done it yet. Why not? You think the other states are going to do it? So we're left with the status quo. There is a problem. How do you fix the problem? That's where I come down on it. There is a problem that needs to be fixed. And what do? Because otherwise, we're heading towards disaster, people. It's a real thing.
I want to add, we will limit it to 1 minute per answer. Is that fair? You guys good with that? Okay.
That makes it a little tight.
Okay, yeah.
I'll just be real quick. ConventionStates.com. You can see maps of different proposed results of proposed amendments that might happen. I think New Mexico might be a purple state at best. It wasn't long ago that it was a red state.
Give him a little extra time.
That's the baby's phone.
Anyway, there are different scenarios that you can look at. We don't propose specific amendments because we want the convention to get together from different perspectives to say, okay, how much fiscal restraint should we put on this government? Should we let them raise their debt limit with a simple majority? Or should maybe have the states decide if the debt limit goes up? These are types of subject questions and issues that we can put together. Nationwide, over 70% of Republicans agree with what we're doing. Over 60% of independents agree with our three areas. And over 50% of Democrats agree with us. So to answer your question, yes, I think it matters.